Okay, guys, I apologize once again for cutting off. Something came up. Back to where we were before we left off. Here in this particular example, we're showing some situations in which an individual or a firm may not want to go with the weighted average cost of capital for all projects. And in this particular example, we're showing a couple projects, A, B, C, and looking at the distinctions between using the weighted average cost of capital as your decision maker or using IRR versus your required return. And if we compare the IRR versus the required return, which we were talking about before, we saw that when the IRR is greater than the required return, we're going to accept, which is situations like project B and C. And when it's the opposite, when the required return is greater than the IRR, you're going to want to reject. So thinking about this in different terms, you could think which projects would be accepted if you just use the weighted average cost of capital for the discount rate. So you could compare that 15% to the IRRs and accept. You're probably going to accept those first two projects, which you see here for the weighted average cost of capital you do accept. And then you think, well, which projects should be accepted if you use the required return based on the risk of the project? And what we just said was that you would accept B and C. So the moral of the story here is, so what happened when we used the weighted average cost of capital? We accepted a risky project that we shouldn't have and rejected a less risky project that we should have accepted. And what would happen to the overall risk of the firm if the company does this on a consistent basis? Most people would say that the firm would become riskier, right? So this is the issue here that we would want to avoid. Oops. This gets into divisions. We talked a little bit about projects there. If we use the weighted average cost of capital as a hurdle rate for all projects, in other words, you want to get over that particular rate in order to accept or reject projects. And we did it for across the board for all projects. You'd see that would be that flat red line here, and anything over that we'd accept, anything below we'd reject. You consider that against using a risk-adjusted cost of capital, which is this blue sloped line. And the thought is that, as projects become certain projects and certain divisions are more risky than other divisions, therefore having a weighted average cost of capital across the board for the firm is probably not as smart as having a weighted average cost of capital for, low-risk divisions versus high-risk divisions. Maybe a higher weighted average cost of capital for high-risk divisions and a lower weighted average cost of capital for low-risk divisions. It makes more sense that way. That way you're trying to be as efficient as possible across the firm. Okay, so that wraps up, I believe, Chapter 12, as far as the things that are going to be noteworthy for our purposes. So we're going to move on to, let me see here, Chapter 13, which is on leverage and capital structure. Just bear with me for just a second. Get things together here. So leverage is actually a topic that has been very newsworthy recently, given a lot of what's been occurring in the both here and abroad. A lot of people are talking about leverage in regards to the financial crisis. And leverage is basically a term for borrowing. You can think of it as taking on more debt. And it's typically described as a ratio debt to earnings, for example, or debt to capital. For a company, it could be 5-to-1. A company has 5 times the amount of debt on its books than it earns in a year, or funds. In a fund's case, it's borrowed 5 times more than the capital it has on its balance sheet. You may have heard of funds and banks levered as much as 25-to-1. But leverage is not necessarily a bad thing, but too much can be a bad thing. So the typical description I do when I talk about this in class is thinking about this like a balloon. I've heard this before, and I think it's a good metaphor. You can think of the framework or skin as the system in which a firm's operating or an economy's operating. And you blow it up, it has stocks, it has bonds. It can take a shot if you pinch it. It'll just move a bit and functions okay. But once you get leverage involved, you borrow more and it expands and expands. And now the economy or the firm, depending on what you're talking about, grows. It expands. It can still take a shot, but maybe a little less. And in terms of the financial crisis for an economy, for us, when we had mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps, certified debt obligations, and so on and so forth, it was becoming more and more tense, and there was a little bit more strain within the figurative leverage balloon, and it became a little easier to pop. And this is the problem with leverage. The more you borrow, the easier it is to wipe out everything you have. So the solution is to try to de-lever, but with de-levering, there's an issue. And I think this is a very contemporarily important issue politically, not only in the U.S. but abroad, where there's really only 2 ways to get out of this problem when you have a leverage situation. In other words, you have too much debt. You can lower the debt, but unfortunately lowering the debt is going to involve some sort of painful consequences. And the other alternative is to raise earnings or capital, or in an economy situation, to raise GDP. So with the second approach, you could actually argue that you should borrow more to raise earnings or capital or grow the economy in order to get earnings or the economy closer to what you're looking for. So this is kind of the situation the U.S. is in, and a lot of countries are in right now. We have this global economy that we're trying to de-lever. The Fed has tried to adjust interest rates. In the sense, you could think of them as trying to keep the hand on the mouth of the balloon, letting some air out and so on and so forth. Basically, the debt to GDP equation, so debt over GDP, is the primary issue here. And it's not only an issue in the U.S., it's an issue abroad. They're trying to deflate the balloon, but doing it slowly. And you get volatility in the market if there's a large amount of deleveraging. And the Fed, personally, I think, believes that we're in a deflationary environment. So they're trying to tame debt to GDP with inflation. So they're trying to shrink the balloon by blowing in and letting out and hoping that the balloon will heal itself and taking on its own inflation. The issue is, of course, is that there's these attempts that they've gone about could worsen the balloon if too much more air gets in. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Fed is changing its approach now. So I typically like to talk about that because I think it's important, and it's something that is going on contemporarily today in the U.S. and abroad. And it does have to do with this exact chapter on leverage. So some of the stuff that we're going to try to understand in this chapter are the effect of financial leverage on cash flows and the cost of equity. So we're going to talk about debt and how it affects cash flows and the cost of equity. And we're going to talk about the impact of taxes and bankruptcy on the capital structure choice, the basic components of bankruptcy process, And here is our chapter outline. All right. So the capital structure, what is this? The capital structure, well, this is, first off, this is an important concept. Capital structure is the percent of debt and equity used to fund the firm's assets. Leverage is the use of debt in a capital structure. Capital restructuring is the changing the amount of leverage without changing the firm's assets. You can increase leverage by issuing debt and repurchasing outstanding shares. You can decrease leverage by issuing new shares and retiring outstanding debt. Of course, that's not going to work the same way for an economy, but the same premise exists. It's not going to work the same way because of the shares aspect. Of course, you don't have shares for an economy.